My name is Jacob, and until recently, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where I came from. But all that crumbled on a quiet Sunday afternoon when, by accident, I uncovered a secret my family had been hiding for years. A secret that would come to define every relationship, every moment, and every memory I had of them. I was organizing some old documents in my father's office. He had asked me to help file papers, and of course, I agreed. I've always been close to him, even though our relationship had its ups and downs. I always thought he was a steady, reliable figure, a kind of anchor for the family. I would never have imagined that anything there could radically change what I thought. Not until that day. In the third drawer of his file cabinet, as I was stacking dusty documents, I found a different folder. It looked untouched, with an old but sturdy rubber band that held the sheets tightly together. The title on the cover was straightforward and sent a shiver down my spine. Confidential, for review. I felt a wave of curiosity that quickly turned to nervousness. Maybe I should have left it there, but the truth is that something inside me whispered that I needed to open it. And that's what I did. When I opened the folder, I saw a series of letters and records dated more than 10 years ago. Each sheet I read left me more stunned, more shocked. There, in cold detail, were documented details about a company that I never knew my father had founded with my older brother, Lucas. It was a company that had failed, yes, but the problem wasn't the bankruptcy itself. I discovered that my brother, encouraged by my father, had used my name and my credit for a loan years ago without my knowledge. And after the company went bankrupt, the debt had been paid off with part of an inheritance I didn't even know existed. An inheritance my mother had left for us before she passed away when I was still a child. Sitting on the floor of the office, I felt the weight of the words, the lies. My own family had hidden something so important from me, something that, in a way, defined the trusting relationship I had always had with them. That money, that debt that I never chose to take on, was now buried in a past I couldn't change. My mind struggled to process it all. A whirlwind of questions piled up, a new pain emerged. Why didn't my father and brother ever tell me anything? Why did they think they could use my name, my identity, without even consulting me? My eyes burned, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a mix of anger and sadness that I didn't even know how to contain. When I left the office that night, I decided to confront them. The idea of hiding what I knew was unbearable. I wanted to hear the reason, to know if there was any reason that could justify the betrayal. Within a few days, with a heavy heart and a boiling mind, I asked everyone to meet for a serious conversation. And as soon as we sat around the table, each one looking more suspicious than the last, I revealed what I had discovered. The expressions were of shock, but not exactly for the reason I expected. My father fell silent, trying to disguise his guilt, and Lucas could barely look me in the eye. After a moment of suffocating tension, my father spoke, and the justification he gave only served to increase the emptiness I felt. He tried to say that everything was to protect the family, to keep the company alive, and, in some way, to secure a financial future for me. But his tone of voice was cold, calculating, as if he didn't even recognize what it had cost me emotionally. My brother, in turn, said that he had just followed what my father had instructed, without considering that it could affect me. The lack of remorse, the naturalness with which they both spoke, was like a punch in the stomach. After hearing them, I realized that something had changed definitively within me. It was as if I was surrounded by strangers, as if that bond that I valued so much had been cut, and I didn't know if it could be restored. I no longer knew if I could trust those people who I always considered my family. As everyone got up from the table, I stayed there alone, trying to figure out how to move forward. The pain was deep, like a wound that wouldn't heal anytime soon. However, a question echoed in my mind. Could I forgive them? Would I one day be able to look at them without remembering the betrayal? The pain of discovering that my own father and brother had betrayed me? The only thing I knew was that, at that moment, I needed distance. After that night, I knew something had to change. The hurt not only consumed me from within, but also seemed to become a chasm between me and what I once called home. The conversation we had only served to make everything heavier. Still, as much as it hurt, I felt I needed to confront them again. I had questions that needed to be answered, and I wouldn't just accept empty justifications. The next morning, I gathered my courage and went back to my parents' house. The place that had always been a refuge, a symbol of security, now seemed strange. The walls, the furniture, everything seemed suffocating, as if those long-hidden secrets were ingrained in every corner. My father and Lucas were in the living room, in a silence that I knew would only be broken by me. "I want to understand why you did this to me," I began, without mincing words. "I want to understand how my own name, my identity, could be used without even asking me. It's not just the financial consequences. It's what it says about who you are to me." My father, with a weary look, seemed to rehearse an answer, but nothing he said made sense. He began to talk in circles, trying to justify the decision as a need for the good of the family. He said he believed the company was the great opportunity of his and Lucas's life, something that would make them successful, that would secure our future. But to me, it sounded like flimsy excuses, empty attempts to cover up the truth, the mistake, and the lack of consideration. It was as if I was just a detail, a convenient resource to be used and discarded. Lucas, on the other hand, avoided looking me in the eye. I knew he felt guilty, but pride, or perhaps fear of admitting his own weakness, kept him from apologizing. "I just did what Dad suggested," he mumbled, looking down. At the time, I thought everyone would win. Those words hit me like a cold blade. "You thought everyone would win?" I repeated, incredulous. "But what about me? You involved me in this without even a conversation. You took something that was mine, that you didn't even know if I wanted to use for that." Lucas shook his head, impatient. "Jacob, you were never one to get involved in family decisions. We thought you wouldn't even care." That made me even angrier. It's true that since I was a kid, I've always had my more reserved way. But that didn't give them the right to decide for me. My feelings, my opinions never seemed relevant to them. And now, this neglect had become a real, concrete betrayal. That conversation dragged on, and it seemed like we were moving in circles, never getting anywhere. My father continued to justify his actions as if they were part of a bigger plan that, by chance, went wrong. Lucas tried to minimize everything, as if the problem was me taking things too seriously. With every word of theirs, I felt the distance between us grow. My mother, who had always been the conciliator of the family, was no longer there to try to calm things down. And perhaps that's what hurt me the most. Without her, we were just loose fragments of a family, trying to fill in the gaps with empty words. At that moment, I realized that her figure was always the one that kept us together, and now we were adrift, without a compass to guide us. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said in a low but firm tone. "I feel like I don't understand who you are anymore. And maybe I need to distance myself to find out if there is still any bond worth rescuing." My father sighed, and for the first time, he seemed to really understand the gravity of what I was saying. "Jacob, I know you're hurt, and I accept your decision to distance yourself if that's what you need. But know that, deep down, I believed I was doing the best for all of us." Those words, instead of calming me, left me even more empty. There wasn't any sincere apology, just a practical excuse. It was as if he was saying that his love was conditional on convenience and interests. That wasn't what I understood by family. Lucas, however, remained silent, giving me furtive glances, perhaps hoping I would soften the situation or be more tolerant. But I couldn't. There was a line that, when they crossed it, they destroyed a part of me that I didn't know how to recover. Without looking back, I left my parents' house that day with one certainty. I needed time. I needed space. The hurt was ingrained in me like a wound that pulsed with every breath, and I didn't know how to heal it being close to them. When I got home, I looked for someone I could trust, someone who could help me understand what to do with all that. It was then that a close friend suggested I seek professional help. At first, I hesitated. The idea of talking to a stranger about my pain seemed strange. But, in truth, that was the only path I could see to process all of that. The therapist I found, a man named Dr. Carter, welcomed me with a calmness I didn't even know I needed. He listened to every detail, without interrupting, only encouraging me to expose everything that was kept inside. Throughout the sessions, he helped me understand that I had the right to feel betrayed and that forgiving or not forgiving was a choice only I could make and in my own time. Gradually, I began to realize that forgiveness wasn't an obligation, but a possibility. Dr. Carter also made me reflect on what it meant to forgive. It wasn't about forgetting or minimizing what they had done, but choosing whether I wanted to carry that burden forever or if I was ready to let it go. The problem was that, deep down, a part of me wanted to keep the distance. Perhaps that distance was the only safe way to preserve what was left of me. Over time, I began to find a balance, even though the wound was far from healed. I needed to decide whether I would forgive them and, if so, how that would affect my life and my relationships. I still didn't know what my final choice would be. But one thing was certain. This distance I chose to create might be the only space where I could, at least for a while, begin to heal myself. The weeks passed, and little by little, I tried to organize the chaos that had settled within me. The decision to distance myself from my family seemed right, but it didn't bring the peace I expected. The pain was still there, throbbing, like an open wound that only seemed to grow. There were days when I felt at peace with the decision to cut off contact, but on others, the longing for happy times, especially for my mother, made me question whether distance was the final answer. In these emotional ups and downs, my routine was reduced to work and therapy sessions with Dr. Carter. He encouraged me to explore in depth what forgiveness meant to me, and also what definitive distance would really bring to my life. It was there, in his office, that I began to face my own ghosts, the pieces that were broken long before I discovered the family secret. Jacob, tell me, what exactly are you afraid of when you distance yourself from your family? Dr. Carter asked me once, in a calm but direct tone. I was silent, staring into the void for a moment. The truth was that I feared the emptiness, the absence. My mother always said that family was our foundation, our safe harbor, and seeing myself without that base left me vulnerable, without a place to return to. Until then, I thought I could face the world without problems as long as I was sure they would be there. But now, with this break, I was like a boat adrift, and the fear of being alone was real. I think what hurts me is the idea that without them, I'm completely alone, I finally answered. I think the betrayal made me realize that maybe I never really had that base. Dr. Carter nodded, understanding. He helped me understand that we often cling to an idealized image of people, especially our parents and siblings, and that facing reality, the truth about who they really are, can be devastating. It wasn't just the fact that they had betrayed me. It was the fact that I had lost that illusion, that I had seen that they were fallible, human, capable of making serious mistakes with me. As our sessions continued, I began to realize something I didn't expect. Forgiveness was a possible choice, but not for them, but for me. Dr. Carter never forced any decision. He just made me see that forgiving didn't mean forgetting or pretending nothing happened. Forgiving, he explained, was a way to lighten the load, to not allow resentment to continue consuming me. It was an act of liberation, of letting go of the pain to be able to move on. But, at the same time, that didn't mean I needed to resume contact or force reconciliation. This idea of forgiving without returning began to take hold as a real possibility, although it wasn't easy. I began to imagine if I could follow a path where the hurt was no longer present, but where I still kept the distance necessary to protect myself. Dr. Carter suggested that I try writing letters, even if I never sent them. Writing can help organize feelings, name what's inside you, Jacob, and sometimes that act of expressing is already a great relief. So I started writing first to my father. In the first lines, the anger exploded. I said everything that was stuck in my throat, every feeling of betrayal, every frustration. As I went through the pages, I realized that what I really felt was a deep sadness, a mourning for a relationship that, in my view, would never be the same again. Writing that letter was like emptying a weight from my chest. When I finished, I realized I was tired, but somehow relieved. I wrote to Lucas too, though it was even harder. My relationship with him had always been complicated. He was the older brother, the figure I always admired, and with whom I sought a connection that he rarely seemed to reciprocate. Putting on paper how I felt about being used by him, seeing that he treated me as a mere resource, was painful but also liberating. The letters gave me a clarity I didn't expect. I understood that, as much as they had disappointed me, the choice of carrying that pain forever was mine. As I dealt with these emotions, an unexpected event brought me even more dilemmas. My father had a sudden health problem, a heart attack. When I heard, I was flooded with conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to rush to the hospital, stay by his side, and support him, but another part hesitated. The wound of betrayal was still there, and the fear that proximity would rekindle that pain was real. I spent the whole night awake, pondering whether or not to go. In the end, I decided I would. I needed to see my father, not only for him, but also to understand how I truly felt. At the hospital, I saw Lucas by our father's side, and for a moment, that scene seemed so common, so familiar, that I almost forgot everything that had happened. But as I approached, the tension was palpable. Lucas looked at me in surprise, but quickly looked away, as if he were still carrying the weight of guilt. My father, still frail, cracked a small smile when he saw me. I felt a mixture of compassion and pain as I looked at him. He was the man who, despite everything, I still loved, even if that love was stained by everything he had done. I sat next to him, and for a moment, silence enveloped us. He tried to speak, but I interrupted him. "Dad, I'm here because I care. But I'm also here to understand if there's anything in us that's still worth salvaging. I can't pretend anymore that everything's okay." He nodded, with discreet tears in his eyes, and for the first time, I saw in him a look of genuine remorse. They weren't practical apologies or empty justifications. It was an expression of someone who truly felt the weight of their own choices. I left the hospital that day without the definitive answer for forgiveness, but with a new clarity. Perhaps the way wasn't simply to forgive and move on, or to walk away forever. Maybe, as Dr. Carter had suggested, I could find a middle ground, a place where I could honor my own peace without ignoring what I felt for them. The pain of betrayal still existed, but there, in that hospital room, I realized that forgiveness, when and if I was ready, wouldn't be to absolve them, but to ease the weight I carried. It was about freeing myself from the bitterness that consumed me, regardless of where my path led me from there. After that visit to the hospital, something in me seemed to have changed. I can't say that the resentment disappeared, but I felt that there was room to see the situation with less anger and more clarity. It was as if, seeing them vulnerable, my father especially, I remembered that love and disappointment can coexist. Still, the decision of whether to forgive them or keep my distance tormented me, and I realized that I needed a final encounter with them, something that would truly bring me an answer. A few weeks later, my father called me. He was recovering well from the heart attack, but his voice seemed aged, frail. He asked, cautiously, if I could go to their house. He said he needed to talk to me about everything that had happened, without rushing, without evading. Something about his voice seemed sincere, and I accepted the invitation, even with a certain apprehension of seeing myself, once again, lost in that whirlwind of emotions. Upon arriving, I noticed that Lucas was already there. He looked at me, somewhat uncomfortable, and nodded. It wasn't exactly an apology, but something about his demeanor made me feel like he was also waiting for this moment, as if he were tired of carrying the weight of what he did. We sat in the living room, and I barely recognized the environment. It was the same place where we spent so many years, where we laughed and celebrated together. But now everything seemed distant, as if I were in a place that was both familiar and strange. There was something in the air, a tension, but also a desire to be right, a need to break the silence that had settled between us. My father started, looking at me with a sincerity I had rarely seen before. "Jacob, I know we failed you. I'm not going to try to hide that. I know what we did was wrong, and that our silence afterwards only made things worse." He sighed, and for a moment he seemed more tired than I'd ever seen him. "At the time, I believed I was doing the best for the family," he continued, his voice now choked. "But the truth is that I had no right to decide for you. to use what was yours without even asking. I'm not going to ask you to forgive us, because I know it's not up to me, but I want you to know that, since you found out, there's not a day that I don't deeply regret it. Lucas, sitting next to him, cleared his throat, seeming finally ready to speak. Jacob, I don't even know where to begin, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. When Dad suggested I use your name, I should have refused. But at the time, I was so desperate to make the company work, to prove that I was capable, that I ignored everything. I only thought about myself, about succeeding. I didn't consider the impact it would have on you. And that's one of the things that hurts me the most to this day. It was the first time I had seen Lucas admit his own fault without trying to deflect, without pushing the blame onto someone else. He had always been proud, always had a huge difficulty in admitting any weakness. Seeing him speak so honestly was like seeing a new side of him, one I didn't know existed. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the responsibility that hung over me. They were finally admitting guilt, acknowledging the impact of their actions, but I didn't know if that was enough to erase what I felt. The pain and disappointment were still there, but at the same time, there was a part of me that wanted to forgive, that wanted to free myself from that weight. I understand what you're saying. I began trying to organize my thoughts. But the problem is that for a long time, I felt completely worthless. It wasn't just the money or the debt. It was the fact that you acted as if I were just a tool, a disposable piece in a plan that didn't even belong to me. Lucas looked at me, his eyes welling up. Jacob, I know, and I'm so sorry for that. Really, I know words won't change anything, but I want you to know that if I could go back, I'd do everything differently. My father continued, we don't expect you to erase what happened. We know that maybe you prefer to keep your distance and that we will never have the same relationship as before. But I needed you to know of our remorse, that you know that none of this was done with the intention of hurting you. We just wanted to ask you for one last chance to try to rebuild this, if it's not too late. Those words, that request for a new chance, left me conflicted. Part of me wanted to accept, to try to salvage something of what remained. Another part, however, still carried the fear of being disappointed again, of everything being an empty promise. I knew that opening that door would require immense courage, but perhaps that was exactly what I needed. I looked at them, feeling the weight of a decision that could change everything. I still don't know what will be from now on, I began. Forgiving you, it's not a simple thing for me. It hurt me deeply, and I know I can't pretend nothing happened. But at the same time, I think I don't want to spend the rest of my life trapped in this pain. I don't want this to define me. There was silence. They nodded, respecting my time, my indecision. My father leaned forward, looking at me with a mixture of hope and remorse. I understand, son. The decision is yours, and we will respect what you decide. But know that, on our part, we are here, willing to win back your trust. I knew that the path would be long and that if there was true forgiveness, it would need to be built gradually, with patience and respect. And at that moment, I decided to open a door, however small, to that possibility. I told them that there would be no guarantees, that I would need time, and that any step to reconnect our bonds would have to come with sincerity and mutual respect. They agreed, and I felt that for the first time in a long time, there was a genuine understanding between us. I left that house feeling light, not because I had completely forgiven, but because I had allowed a new stage to begin, a stage where I was in control of what was best for me. That choice, to give a new chance, albeit cautiously, brought me an unexpected peace. I understood that forgiveness wasn't a gift to them, but a way for me to free myself, to rebuild myself without the weight of resentment. From that last meeting, my life took a turn I never imagined, deciding to give a chance to reconcile with my family. Even without guarantees was like opening a door that, until then, I had kept locked inside me. However, I knew that the path ahead would be made of small steps. Forgiveness wasn't immediate, nor easy. It was something that would need to be cultivated over time if it were to truly blossom. I was willing to try, but on my own terms. During that time, I resumed keeping a certain distance, not of rupture, but of precaution. Occasional encounters were happening. Sunday lunches, brief visits and conversations that remained light, almost superficial. I didn't want to touch the past, and they, respecting my need for time, also avoided mentioning the subject. It was strange, but at the same time, a way to build a new foundation where hopefully trust could grow again. Whether that was a complete reconciliation or just an emotional armistice, I didn't know yet, but at least I felt in control of my own feelings. Lucas, in particular, seemed to be making a genuine effort to mend our relationship. He would invite me out to talk, and even though I was uncomfortable at first, I allowed him to get closer. One afternoon, he invited me for coffee and, between sips and silences, revealed things he had never shared. He talked about his own insecurities, about how he always felt the pressure to live up to our father's expectations and how, because of that, he ended up losing himself. He confessed that that project that involved me was an attempt to prove something to himself, to find self-worth. And ironically, he ended up sacrificing the only relationship that could truly give him any emotional support. As he spoke, I realized that, as different as our trajectory was, we also carried similar burdens, pressures, and expectations that shaped who we became. For the first time, I saw Lucas without the armor he always wore. He was just a man trying to deal with his own failures, just like me. At the end of that conversation, something in our relationship began to transform, a bond that was no longer sustained by idealizations or dependencies, but by a more authentic understanding. With my father, the process was different. He was a more closed man, more resistant to exposing his vulnerabilities. Our relationship remained cordial, but distant, until one day, in a conversation that began like any other, he asked me to walk with him around the neighborhood. It was a cold afternoon, the sky cloudy, and I remember walking in silence for a long time, until he finally stopped and looked me in the eye. "Jacob, you know I'm not a man of words," he began with a serious expression, almost somber. "But I need you to understand that nothing I did was meant to hurt you, even if that was the consequence." I remained silent, listening, as he continued. "When your mother passed away, I found myself lost, not knowing how to move forward. What I did to you, I have no excuse. Maybe I tried to replicate what she would do, making decisions for the family, without realizing that I wasn't her. That my decisions, in the end, brought more pain than anything else." Hearing this, I realized that my father, in all his toughness, was also broken, maybe even more than me. He had clung to an idea of family that, without my mother, became fragile and flawed. And at that moment, I felt an empathy that I never imagined I would feel. For the first time, I saw my father as a man, not as an immutable figure, and that vision made everything more human, more real. The forgiveness that, until then, I believed would be impossible, began to emerge naturally. I no longer needed to hear words of remorse or guarantees that it would never happen again. I saw, in every gesture and in every word of theirs, that the weight of guilt was there, and that was enough for me. I understood that their true redemption would come from their actions, from the way they would treat our relationship from then on, without subterfuge. From that moment on, I began to invest more in our relationships. It wasn't a total surrender. There was still a natural caution, but I no longer carried the resentment like before. I started to visit them more often, allowing myself to rebuild, piece by piece, a relationship that didn't resemble the one we had before, but that in its honesty seemed more real. Time passed, and I noticed that my heart, previously heavy, was starting to feel lighter. I no longer needed to distance myself to preserve my peace, because that peace was coming from within. It was as if, by forgiving them, I had freed myself from an emotional prison I had built around myself. I no longer needed to carry resentment like armor. I could allow myself to be vulnerable again. The relationship with Lucas also blossomed in an unexpected way. He became more present, more open. We started to share parts of our lives, projects and dreams that before we would never have shared. He was more humble, more willing to listen, and that created a kind of partnership I never imagined possible. Over time, resentment transformed into a silent understanding that each of us carries our own pains, our own regrets, and that in the complexity of being a family, we all learn, somehow, to endure, and to forgive. Ultimately, reconciliation with my family wasn't what I imagined. It wasn't a return to what we were, nor a reconstruction of unshakable trust. It was something new, a more vulnerable, more honest relationship, where the wounds of the past still existed, but were now a part of what made us close. I had learned to accept that they, like me, were human, prone to flaws, and that forgiving them was the best way to free myself from the ghosts of the past. Looking back at all we've lived through, I realized that the decision to give my family another chance wasn't just to save them, but to save myself. I didn't want to be a person defined by hurt. I didn't want to live imprisoned by something that, deep down, was already over. Forgiveness, I discovered, is an act of courage, a step towards something greater than pride or pain. Today, when I sit at the table with my father and brother, I feel there's a silent understanding between us, a connection that transcends the past. They know that trust is something we will build day by day, and I know that, as long as we are together, there will always be a chance to redeem the best of who we are. The choice between forgiveness and distance was one I had to make, but now I understand that it was never about them. It was always about me and the person I wanted to be, someone capable of forgiving, starting over, and moving forward without the weight of resentment and with a heart at peace.
Hi, you are on the Moving Narratives channel. Subscribe and follow our stories.